January 7th, 1945, over the Philippine island of Negros. Four heavily armed American P-38 Lightnings ambush a single, underpowered Japanese Ki-43 Oscar, flying low over the jungle canopy. Leading the flight is Major Thomas McGuire, the second highest scoring ace in U.S. history, with 38 confirmed kills. This should be a routine victory. Instead, within minutes, the American formation shatters. McGuire's aircraft violently plunges into the earth. The legendary ace is killed instantly, not by enemy fire, but by a fatal aerodynamic stall. How does a master pilot, flying a superior machine with a 4-to-1 advantage, make a fatal rookie mistake in a fight he was guaranteed to win? Back in the United States, the Pacific Air War wasn't being sold to the public as a desperate, daily struggle for survival. The American press had packaged it into a high-stakes sporting event, a frantic, headline-grabbing race to the top of a very deadly scoreboard. At the center of this media fanfare were the nation's two greatest fighter pilots. On one side was Richard Bong, who had just been rotated safely home as a living legend, holding what seems like an unbeatable record of 40 confirmed kills. On the other was Thomas McGuire, sitting dangerously close with 38. The public tracked their daily tallies like baseball statistics, cheering for McGuire to catch the invincible Bong. But that scoreboard was a lethal illusion. Behind the patriotic newspaper columns and the painted flags on an aluminum fuselage, each number represented a brutal, unforgiving fight for life. In the skies over the Pacific, the enemy didn't care about American headlines or personal milestones. In that environment, a single moment of misplaced focus or desperation meant burning alive over a hostile jungle. How did one of the greatest tacticians in the world fall victim to a situation he was perfectly trained to dominate? We're going to uncover the intense psychological pressure of a legendary, unspoken rivalry. We will expose the ironclad rule of flying the American Lightning and break down the agonizing, fatal few seconds that turned a flawless 4-on-1 ambush into an aviation catastrophe. Because to comprehend the mistake that ended Thomas McGuire's life, we first have to understand the mind of a man chasing a phantom record. To understand that chase, you have to look at the man who set the target and the stark, almost uncomfortable contrast between the two greatest fighter pilots the United States had ever produced. The Army Air Forces had never intended to create a gladiatorial spectacle in the Pacific theater, but human nature and a media hungry for heroes demanded one. At the top of the pyramid sat Richard Bong, a blonde, round-faced farm boy from Poplar, Wisconsin. Bong was an anomaly in the world of fighter aviation. He did not possess the swaggering, larger-than-life ego typically associated with men who made their living shooting other men out of the sky. He was quiet, unassuming, and almost painfully shy around war correspondents. He approached aerial combat not as a glorious crusade, but as a mechanical task that he happened to be exceptionally good at. Bong didn't hunt for fame. He actively avoided it. He claimed he was a terrible shot who just liked to get dangerously close to his targets before pulling the trigger, a modest deflection of his lethal, cold-blooded efficiency. By late 1944, he had survived incredible odds to reach 40 confirmed victories. Recognizing that his luck could not hold out forever, and terrified of the propaganda disaster that would follow the death of America's ace of aces, the High Command abruptly pulled Bong off combat duty. He was grounded, hailed as a national treasure, and sent safely home to the United States to sell war bonds. His record of 40 kills was frozen in time, sitting at the top of the scoreboard like an immovable monument. For Thomas McGuire, that monument was a daily obsession. If Richard Bong was ice, Thomas McGuire was fire. Raised in New Jersey and highly educated, McGuire was a complex, fiercely intelligent, and intensely ambitious officer. He was not content to simply do his job and go home to a quiet life. He possessed a burning desire for recognition, a relentless inner drive that demanded he be acknowledged as the absolute best in the world. Where Bong was universally loved for his easygoing nature, McGuire was deeply respected, but often considered abrasive, demanding, and sharp-elbowed. He carried a little black book filled with detailed tactical notes, analyzing every engagement, calculating angles, and meticulously tracking his own progress. He didn't just want to survive the war. He wanted to conquer it. He wanted the Medal of Honor, and he openly, passionately wanted Bong's record. The psychological weight of being number two consumed him. Every time McGuire landed his heavily armed fighter on a dusty, coral-crushed airstrip, the questions were the same. The ground crews, the wingmen, the embedded reporters, everyone wanted to know how close he was getting. The Pacific Air War was an exhausting, brutal meat grinder, where pilots routinely died of malaria, fatigue, and sudden, unseen ambushes from the sun. Yet, driven by this singular, burning ambition, McGuire refused to slow down. He pushed himself and his men to the absolute breaking point, taking every available flight, scanning the glaring horizon for any sign of a Japanese aircraft, turning every patrol into a relentless hunting expedition. For a long time, Bong's record of 40 seemed mathematically out of reach. McGuire was a brilliant pilot, but the gap was just too wide, and the skies over the Pacific were slowly emptying of Japanese targets as the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force was ground into dust. But then came the American invasion of the Philippines and the frantic, desperate Japanese counterattacks over the islands of Leyte and Mindoro. The impossible gap suddenly closed over 2 days of unprecedented, hyper-violent aerial combat. On Christmas Day, December 25th, 1944, McGuire led his flight into a swirling, chaotic dogfight against a swarm of Japanese fighters. Flying with lethal precision, he tore through the enemy formations, shooting down 3 Japanese aircraft in a single mission. The adrenaline rush was intoxicating. The very next day, December 26th, refusing to let the momentum die, he went back into the sky. In another brutal engagement, he systematically hunted down and destroyed 4 more enemy planes. 7 confirmed kills in a span of 48 hours. It was a staggering, almost incomprehensible display of aerial mastery. But more importantly, those 2 days of combat completely shattered the established reality of the scoreboard. In less than a weekend, Thomas McGuire's total violently jumped from 31 to 38. Suddenly, Richard Bong's untouchable record of 40 was right there. It was no longer a distant phantom. It was a physical reality breathing down McGuire's neck. He only needed 2 kills to tie the ace of aces, and 3 to claim the crown for himself. The psychological pressure, already immense, now skyrocketed into the stratosphere. Every time he strapped into his cockpit, the weight of the entire nation's expectations sat on his shoulders. He was the undisputed top gun still flying in the theater, but he was trapped beneath a glass ceiling of 38, desperate to break through before the war ended or his own luck ran dry. The instrument of this monumental ambition was a machine that cared nothing for human ego, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. This was not a delicate, canvas-covered biplane, nor was it a nimble, lightweight dogfighter. The Lightning was a massive, imposing piece of industrial machinery. It was a 7-ton, twin-boom heavy fighter, powered by 2 supercharged, 1,600 horsepower Allison engines. With a heavy cluster of 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon concentrated right in the nose, it didn't just shoot down enemy aircraft, it sawed them in half. But the P-38 was a beast of momentum and inertia. It was a highly sophisticated weapon that demanded absolute, uncompromising discipline from the pilot in the cockpit. It rewarded extreme calculation. If a pilot used its tremendous speed, its rapid climb rate, and its heavy firepower to execute slashing, hit-and-run attacks, the Lightning was virtually untouchable. It was a mechanical predator of the highest order. However, it was also a brutally unforgiving machine that severely punished anyone who ignored its physical limitations. It did not tolerate emotion. It did not tolerate panic. And above all, it did not tolerate a pilot who tried to force it outside of its rigid, aerodynamic envelope. If you disrespected the laws of physics in a P-38, the massive aircraft would turn on you in a heartbeat, transforming from a deadly weapon into a 7-ton tomb falling out of the sky. This was the ultimate recipe for a fatal disaster. A pilot burning with an unprecedented, feverish personal ambition, locked inside a cold, rigid machine that violently punished any loss of discipline. Under the crushing pressure of needing just 3 more kills, it would be easy to assume that McGuire simply lost his head, that he was blinded by glory, became reckless, and pushed his heavy fighter beyond its limits in a desperate grab for the record. But Thomas McGuire was not a reckless amateur. He was not a cowboy flying by the seat of his pants. He was the premier intellectual authority on the P-38 in the Pacific Theater. He had literally written the combat manual used by the 5th Air Force. He authored the doctrinal rules on how to survive and win in the Lightning, carefully mapping out the exact boundaries of what the heavy aircraft could and could not do. He understood the lethal consequences of breaking those rules better than any man alive. The impending tragedy was not born of ignorance. It was born of a master tactician knowingly flying straight into the very trap he had trained everyone else to avoid. That trap was the low-speed turning fight. In the tactical manuals he personally authored, McGuire was absolutely emphatic about the laws of survival for a heavy fighter. To win in the Pacific, a P-38 pilot had to fight in 3 dimensions, using sheer kinetic energy as an impenetrable shield. The doctrine was simple, brutal, and highly effective. Use superior altitude to spot the target, push the nose down, and dive. You strike with a concentrated burst of heavy caliber fire, and then you use that immense diving speed to climb right back up into the safety of the upper atmosphere. You dictate the terms of the engagement. You never bleed your energy. You never pull the throttle back. And under absolutely no circumstances do you ever allow yourself to be drawn into a horizontal turning fight near the ground. The reason for this unbreakable rule was the specific aircraft the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force deployed against them, the Nakajima Ki-43, known to the Allies as the Oscar. By the dawn of 1945, the Oscar was widely considered an obsolete relic. Next to the towering, heavily armored Lightning, the Japanese fighter was frail, severely underpowered, and dangerously underarmed. It was built without the heavy armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks that routinely kept American pilots alive. In a straight line, a P-38 could effortlessly outrun it. In a steep dive, the American fighter would leave it completely behind. On paper, it was a hopelessly outclassed machine, supposedly easy prey for experienced American hunters. But the Oscar possessed one terrifying aerodynamic advantage that kept it lethal right up to the final days of the war. Because it was so incredibly light, it boasted a turning radius that defied Western aviation engineering. At high speeds, the Oscar's control surfaces would stiffen, making the aircraft sluggish and unresponsive. But down on the deck, at low speeds, the Ki-43 became a lethal acrobat. It could turn inside almost any fighter the United States produced. It was a machine tailor-made for the intimate, twisting, low-altitude knife fights of a bygone era. This created a rigid, unforgiving tactical reality. A Japanese pilot in an Oscar didn't need to outrun a P-38. He didn't need to climb higher, and he couldn't possibly survive a head-on exchange of gunfire. To win, he only had to do one thing: evade the initial American diving attack, stay close to the jungle canopy, and tempt the heavy Lightnings into a turning dogfight. If the Japanese pilot could just drag the engagement down to the treetops and provoke the Americans into bleeding off their speed in a tight horizontal turn, the physics of the battlefield instantly inverted. Stripped of its momentum, the heavy P-38 would become a sluggish, wallowing target, while the featherweight Ki-43 could effortlessly whip around and lock onto its tail. McGuire understood this mathematical certainty better than anyone. He had spent his entire career drilling this exact scenario into the men under his command. You strike fast, you stay high, and if the enemy survives your first pass, you climb away. You never stay and fight on their terms. Armed with this flawless, blood-tested doctrine, and consumed by the need for just 2 more victories to catch Richard Bong, McGuire led his flight of 4 Lightnings out over the Philippine Islands. It was designed to be a textbook execution of his own rules, a swift, overwhelming ambush against an inferior target. But the lone enemy pilot they were about to encounter had no intention of playing the victim. The engagement began exactly as the tactical manuals dictated. Flying low over the dense jungle canopy of Negros Island, the 4 American Lightnings spotted their prey, a single, olive-drab Ki-43 Oscar cruising slowly below them. To a flight led by the second highest scoring ace in the military, it looked like an absolute gift. It was a 4-on-1 numerical advantage against an obsolete aircraft flying at a disadvantageous altitude. The ambush was initiated. The massive P-38s pushed their noses down, converting their altitude into a lethal surge of kinetic energy, closing the distance in seconds to deliver a rapid, clinical kill. But as the heavy fighters tore into range, the dynamic of the engagement abruptly shifted. The Japanese pilot, widely identified in historical reconstructions as Warrant Officer Akira Sugimoto, did not react like a doomed man. Sugimoto was an experienced combat veteran, and he instantly recognized the silhouette of the heavy, twin-engine Lightnings plunging toward him. He knew immediately that he could not outrun them, and he knew that trying to climb away would only expose his vulnerable aircraft to their concentrated nose armament. He had seconds to react, and he chose the only maneuver that could keep him alive. Without panicking, Sugimoto threw his nimble Oscar into a violently tight, evasive turn, pulling his aircraft down to just a few hundred feet above the dense foliage. He dragged the fight straight into the mud. The American formation instantly began to fracture. As the four heavy P-38s tried to track the twisting, turning Oscar just above the treetops, they were forced into a chaotic, uncoordinated pursuit. They couldn't bring their heavy guns to bear on a target that was constantly, violently altering its trajectory. More critically, by staying low and trying to match the Oscar's evasive maneuvers, the Americans were rapidly bleeding off their immense airspeed. The kinetic energy that formed their impenetrable shield was dissipating with every tight bank and sudden turn. The overwhelming numerical advantage of 4-1 was disintegrating in the frantic, low-altitude chaos as the massive American fighters struggled simply to maintain their line of sight through the trees. Then, the tactical reality completely inverted. Sugimoto, surviving the initial passes, recognized that the heavy American planes had bled off their lethal speed and were now wallowing low over the jungle. With a sudden, aggressive reversal, the Japanese pilot snapped his featherweight Oscar out of its evasive turn and went violently on the offensive. He slipped his agile fighter perfectly into the blind spot of one of the American wingmen. In a matter of heartbeats, the lone, obsolete Japanese aircraft had turned the tables on a four-ship flight of superior fighters, actively threatening to shoot one of McGuire's men out of the sky. The entire engagement now hinged on Thomas McGuire. His wingman was caught in the lethal sights of the Oscar, trapped at low altitude with a highly maneuverable enemy glued to his tail. The tactical doctrine McGuire had written was explicitly clear on how to handle a broken ambush. If the first pass fails, if the enemy evades, and if you lose your energy advantage, you must immediately firewall the throttles, pitch up, and climb away into the safety of altitude to reset the engagement. You do not stay down in the weeds. But climbing away meant abandoning his wingman to an almost certain death. Faced with a disintegrating ambush, McGuire made a fateful, split-second decision. He rejected the safety of altitude, rejected his own tactical doctrine, and chose to stay in the mud. He hauled back on the yoke, dragging his massive 7-ton fighter into a sharp, flat, horizontal turn to intercept the Oscar. Committing his heavy machine to a low-speed turning fight, it was never designed to survive. He was now locked into a desperate maneuver, burdened by a lethal handicap he had entirely forgotten to shed. For decades, history books and armchair tacticians have painted this exact second as a moment of selfish, blind obsession. The popular myth suggests that McGuire, consumed by the glowing prospect of his 39th kill, recklessly threw his aircraft into a dangerous turn simply to shoot down the Oscar before it could escape. It makes for a neat, tragic story of hubris, the ambitious ace who let his ego override his training. But the official Air Force debriefings and the frantic accounts of his surviving wingmen reveal a far more agonizing reality. McGuire was not turning to claim a record. He was turning to save a life. The Japanese fighter had successfully locked onto the tail of an American pilot who was now out of speed, trapped at low altitude, and seconds away from being torn apart by machine gun fire. In that terrifying fraction of a second, Thomas McGuire faced an impossible choice. He could push his throttles forward, climb away, and survive, strictly obeying the tactical doctrine he had written himself, while leaving his wingman to die. Or he could violate every physical law of the P-38 Lightning in a desperate bid to drag the enemy fighter off his comrade's tail. The primal, unspoken human instinct to protect a fellow pilot completely overrode the cold, mechanical discipline he had spent years perfecting. He yanked his yoke hard, trying to force his massive aircraft around to bring his own guns to bear on the Oscar. But in the sheer adrenaline-fueled rush to intervene, the brilliant tactician made one fatal, irreversible omission. Strapped beneath the wings of McGuire's Lightning were two massive aerodynamic anchors, his external drop tanks. Filled with hundreds of gallons of aviation fuel, these tanks added thousands of pounds of dead weight to an already heavy machine. Standard combat procedure dictated that these tanks must be instantly jettisoned the very second an engagement begins. Dropping them sheds the excess weight, restores the fighter's critical center of gravity, and brings the aerodynamic envelope back to combat specifications. McGuire, entirely fixated on the immediate, desperate threat to his wingmen, never reached for the release switches. He was asking a 7-ton heavy fighter to execute a featherweight dogfighting maneuver. He was doing it at a sluggish, rapidly bleeding airspeed, and he was doing it while hauling thousands of pounds of sloshing, unjettisoned fuel, dragging down his wings and completely destroying the smooth airflow over his aircraft. At an altitude of just 300 feet above the unforgiving Philippine jungle canopy, carrying thousands of pounds of dead weight in his drop tanks, Thomas McGuire fully committed his burdened machine into the turn. As the yoke came back, the physical forces acting on the aircraft became absolute and unforgiving. The P-38 Lightning was a marvel of aviation engineering, but it could not rewrite the laws of aerodynamics. In a tight, low-speed bank, a heavy fighter requires a massive amount of lift to keep from falling out of the sky. But lift requires smooth, uninterrupted airflow over the wings and speed to sustain it. McGuire's airspeed was already critically low from the initial chaotic maneuvering just above the treetops. Now, by forcing the massive fighter into a maximum effort horizontal turn, he was exposing the broad, heavy profile of the aircraft to massive aerodynamic drag. The unjettisoned drop tanks acted like deployed parachutes in the airstream. Worse, the hundreds of gallons of raw aviation fuel sloshing inside those tanks violently shifted outward through centrifugal force, throwing the delicate center of gravity completely out of balance. In the cockpit, McGuire would have felt the controls grow terrifyingly soft. The deep, vibrating roar of the twin, supercharged Allison engines strained against the sudden, unnatural drag. But mechanical thrust alone could not save him. The speed bled away in a matter of heartbeats. The needle on his airspeed indicator plummeted past the red line of survivability. In aviation, this exact moment is a mathematical absolute known as an accelerated stall. It happens when the angle of attack becomes so steep and the speed so slow that the air can no longer grip the surface of the wings. In a fraction of a second, the Lightning ceased to be a lethal, flying predator. It transitioned, violently and irrevocably, into 7 tons of dead steel falling out of the sky. When a heavily burdened P-38 stalls in a hard banking turn, it does not simply glide downward. The sudden loss of lift is asymmetrical. The wing on the inside of the turn loses its grip on the air first, stalling out entirely while the outside wing is still generating a fraction of upward force. The result is instantaneous and catastrophic. Before McGuire could even register the total loss of control, the aircraft snapped. The inside wing dropped like a stone, violently flipping the massive fighter into a chaotic, unrecoverable inverted roll. He was violently thrown against his harness as the horizon spun wildly out of view, replaced entirely by the rapidly rushing green blur of the Philippine jungle. If this aerodynamic stall had occurred at 10,000 feet, Thomas McGuire, one of the greatest fighter pilots in the world, would have simply neutralized the controls, let the heavy nose drop to gather airspeed, and flown his way out of it. He had taught hundreds of younger pilots how to do exactly that. But at an altitude of less than 300 feet, there was no air beneath him to trade for speed. There was zero margin for recovery. There was also absolutely no time to bail out. With the massive aircraft suddenly snapping upside down, gravity was pulling him straight into the canopy. The ground was rushing up to meet him at hundreds of feet per second. The entire sequence, from the decision to haul back on the yoke, to the total decay of airspeed, to the violent inverted snap roll, took only a handful of seconds. Before the Japanese pilot in the trailing Oscar even had a chance to line up his sights, before a single decisive burst of machine gun fire was needed to end the fight, the sky simply emptied itself of the American ace. The P-38 slammed nose first into the dense jungle canopy. The impact instantly ruptured the massive fuel tanks McGuire had never dropped. The aircraft disintegrated in a blinding, catastrophic explosion, sending a massive fireball rolling up through the dark green foliage of Negros Island. The deafening roar of the crash echoed across the treetops, followed almost immediately by a chilling, absolute silence over the American radio frequencies. Down below, the jungle rapidly consumed the burning wreckage of the Lightning, and with it, the relentless, all-consuming race for the title of America's greatest ace. The flames in the Philippine jungle didn't just consume an aircraft. They permanently froze the most intensely watched scoreboard of the Pacific War. Thomas McGuire's final tally would forever remain at 38. The relentless chase was over. The title of America's undisputed ace of aces was firmly cemented in the hands of Richard Bong, the quiet farm boy who had been sent safely home with 40 kills. The American press had its definitive winner. But the grim reality of military aviation is that machines do not care about newspaper headlines, and they do not stop demanding perfection just because a pilot has left a combat zone. 7 months after McGuire's fatal stall, the world fundamentally changed. On August 6, 1945, an American bomber dropped an atomic weapon on Hiroshima, signaling the abrupt end of the Second World War. But on that exact same day, thousands of miles away, in the peaceful skies over California, the surviving champion of the Pacific climbed into a cockpit. Richard Bong was no longer flying propeller-driven fighters. He was testing the Lockheed P-38 Shooting Star, an experimental first-generation jet fighter representing a new, unforgiving era of speed. Shortly after takeoff, the primary fuel pump failed. The jet engine flamed out. Just like the heavy Lightning, the P-80 rapidly lost its aerodynamic grace without thrust. At low altitude, with no time to recover, Richard Bong faced the exact same terrifying mathematical absolute that had doomed his greatest rival. Before he could successfully parachute to safety, the jet plummeted into the ground. The man who had survived hundreds of chaotic dogfights, outmaneuvering the absolute best pilots the Japanese Empire could produce, was killed instantly on American soil. The grueling psychological race to the top of the scoreboard had ultimately left no winner. The two greatest American fighter pilots in history had successfully navigated the deadliest skies in the world, yet neither lived to see the war officially conclude. The bitter irony of their intertwined fates is that they were not defeated by the enemy. Thomas McGuire died dragging a heavy fighter back into the obsolete, slow-speed turning fights of the past to save a wingman. Richard Bong died pushing the boundaries of the future, strapped inside a jet-powered machine that had not yet been tamed. In the end, their final battles were not fought against Japanese aviators. They were fought against gravity, aerodynamics, and the cold, unyielding nature of the machines they sought to master. For all the frantic newspaper headlines, the painted flags on aluminum fuselages, and the obsessive race to the top of the scoreboard, the final tally of the Pacific Air War ultimately meant nothing to the sky itself. Thomas McGuire willingly traded his chance at the ultimate record and his life for the survival of a single wingman caught in a fatal, low-altitude trap. Richard Bong survived the entire war, only to be consumed by the unforgiving dawn of a new, jet-powered age. The two most lethal American aviators to ever take flight outlasted the most ferocious human enemies of the 20th century. Yet neither could outrun the brutal, impartial laws of aerodynamics. They conquered the Japanese Empire, but in the end, the sky claimed them both.